Winter doesn't just bring cold. It brings silence. The kind that swallows screams. The kind that freezes evidence beneath layers of snow that won't melt until spring, if anyone's still looking by then. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 true stories from the dead of winter. Stories where the cold wasn't the only thing hunting. Stories where something waited in the white. And stories that prove some things never thaw. Let's begin. Story 1, The Cabin at Whitefish Ridge. In February of 2003, the small logging community of Whitefish Ridge, Montana, consisted of exactly 47 residents. 47 people who knew each other's vehicles by sound, who could identify boot prints in fresh snow, and who understood that when a blizzard warning came through, you stocked up and you stayed inside. The ridge sat 30 miles from the nearest highway, accessible only by a single gravel road that twisted through dense pine forest. Cell service was non-existent. Landlines were reliable until they weren't. And in winter, that road became impassable for days, sometimes weeks at a time. This is where Marcus Thorne made his mistake. Or perhaps, where something was waiting for him to make it. Marcus was a contract surveyor from Billings, 34 years old, experienced in backcountry work. He'd been hired to map property boundaries for a timber company acquiring land near the ridge. The job required him to stay in a small cabin about 8 miles from the main cluster of homes, a weathered structure that had served as a hunting lodge in decades past, now used occasionally by workers who needed temporary shelter. The cabin had power. It had a wood stove. It had supplies. What it didn't have was company. And what it did have, well, we'll get to that. Marcus arrived on February 11th, a Tuesday. The locals at the Ridge's only general store remembered him. Quiet guy. Polite. Bought coffee, batteries, canned goods. Asked about the weather forecast. A storm was coming, expected to hit Thursday night, maybe drop 2 feet. You got enough firewood up there? The store owner, Jim Talbot, had asked him. Marcus nodded. Previous crew left a good stack. I'll be fine. Radio works in that cabin? Tested it yesterday. All good. Jim rang him up, handed over the receipt. Storm gets bad, you call down. We'll know you're all right. Marcus smiled. Said he would. And then he drove his truck back up the logging road toward the cabin, his tire tracks the only marks in the fresh dusting of snow that had fallen that morning. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Thursday came. The storm hit exactly as predicted, howling winds that bent the pines horizontal, snow that fell so thick you couldn't see 5 feet in any direction. The kind of storm that made the world feel erased. Power went out across the ridge around 9 p.m. Standard procedure. Everyone hunkered down, lit their oil lamps, stoked their fires. And up at the cabin, Marcus Thorne should have been doing the same. Should have been. The first indication something was wrong came Saturday morning, when the storm finally broke. Jim Talbot tried the cabin's radio. No response. He tried again an hour later. Nothing. By noon, he was concerned enough to mention it to Bill Hendricks, one of the Ridge's volunteer EMTs. Could be his radio died, Bill suggested. Could be he's just conserving batteries. Could be, Jim agreed. But something sat wrong in his gut. By Sunday, when Marcus still hadn't checked in, 3 men took snowmobiles up the logging road. Jim Talbot, Bill Hendricks, and a logger named Ray Cortez who'd worked these woods for 20 years and knew every turn, every grade, every place where something could go wrong. The ride took 40 minutes through snow that had drifted chest-high in places. When they reached the cabin clearing, they found Marcus's truck buried beneath white, untouched since Thursday. No tire tracks leading out. No footprints around the vehicle. The cabin itself stood dark against the tree line, its windows black rectangles, its chimney silent. No smoke. No light. No sound except the wind moving through the pines with a low, sustained moan that seemed to come from the forest itself. Marcus. Jim called out. His voice fell flat against the snow, absorbed before it could carry. Marcus Thorne. You in there? Nothing. They approached the front door. It was closed but not locked. Ray pushed it open, and the hinges gave a long, grinding creak that echoed through the empty structure. Inside, the cabin was freezing, colder than outside, somehow, as if the walls themselves were radiating chill. Their flashlight beams swept across a scene that made no immediate sense. The wood stove sat cold, its door hanging open, ash spilled across the floor. The interior had been torn apart. Supplies were scattered, cans opened and left half-eaten, frozen solid now. The table was overturned. One of the chairs had been shattered, its legs broken off and lying in different corners of the room like discarded bones. And on the walls? "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered. The words were scratched into the wood paneling. Deep gouges made with something sharp, a knife maybe, or a nail. They covered every surface, the walls, the door frames, even parts of the ceiling that Marcus would have had to stand on furniture to reach. "Don't let it in. It knows my name. 3 knocks every night, 3 knocks. Not human, not human, not. It sounds like her, but she's dead." The scratches were frantic, overlapping, some letters carved so deep the wood had splintered. The men stood in silence, their breath misting in the frigid air, reading the walls like pages from a diary written in terror. "Where is he?" Ray asked quietly. They searched the entire cabin. 1 room. Kitchenette. Small bathroom. Loft accessible by a ladder. Marcus Thorne was nowhere inside. But in the loft, they found his sleeping bag torn open, the insulation pulled out and scattered like something had been searching through it. His surveying equipment lay in pieces. And his boots, his insulated winter boots, sat neatly by the ladder, laces still tied. He went outside barefoot? Jim's voice cracked slightly. "In this?" They returned to the main room. Bill noticed something they'd missed initially, scratch marks on the inside of the front door. Long gouges, the kind made by fingernails clawing at wood. The marks ran from the handle down to the floor, as if someone had been trying desperately to get out, or desperately trying to keep something out by holding the door closed from the inside. And at the threshold, just inside the doorway, they found a thin layer of frost that had formed in a pattern. It took them a moment to recognize what they were seeing. Footprints. Frozen into the floorboards. Small footprints, like a woman's bare feet. They led from the door toward the center of the room, then stopped abruptly in the middle of the floor, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the set of handprints pressed into the frost on the inside of the window glass, the window that faced the forest. Small hands. A woman's hands. Pressed against the glass from the outside. From outside. Looking in. "We need to find him," Ray said, but his voice had gone hollow. They found Marcus Thorne a quarter-mile into the forest, following a trail of disturbance in the snow, a dragging path, as if something had been pulled. Or as if someone had been crawling. He was kneeling in the snow at the base of a massive pine, his back to them, his body rigid and perfectly upright despite being frozen solid. No coat. No boots. Just his base layer clothing, his bare feet buried in the drift, his hands pressed palm down on his thighs in an almost meditative posture. When they approached from the front, they understood why the recovery team would later require psychological counseling. Marcus's eyes were open. His mouth was open. And his face was locked in an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite recognition, something between the two, something that suggested he'd seen someone he knew. Someone he'd been waiting for. His fingernails were gone. All 10, ripped out at the root. And in the snow around his kneeling body, scattered in a perfect circle, they found them. 10 fingernails. Arranged deliberately, evenly spaced, like markers on a clock face. The autopsy would later determine he'd been dead for approximately 48 hours. Cause of death, hypothermia. But the medical examiner noted in his report, unofficially, never recorded in the final documents, that Marcus's stomach contained wood pulp, as if he'd been eating the cabin's walls. And his throat bore bruising consistent with manual strangulation. His own hands were too frozen to have left those marks. The investigation was brief. State police came up when the roads cleared. They interviewed the Ridge residents, photographed the cabin, documented the scene. Their conclusion, Marcus Thorne had suffered some kind of psychological break brought on by isolation and the storm. He destroyed the cabin in a manic episode, fled into the forest without proper clothing, and succumbed to the elements. The scratched messages on the walls? Paranoid delusions. The footprints? Frost patterns misinterpreted by traumatized witnesses. The arranged fingernails? The work of scavenging animals after death, nothing more. Case closed. But the locals knew better. They knew the cabin's history, something the investigators either didn't uncover or chose to ignore. 30 years prior, in January of 1973, a woman named Eleanor Voss had lived in that cabin with her husband, a trapper. They'd had a fight one night during a blizzard. Witnesses later testified hearing screams carried on the wind. When the storm cleared, Eleanor's husband claimed she'd gone out for firewood and never returned. They found her body in Spring, 3 miles from the cabin, partially consumed by wildlife. But her feet were bare. And she'd been wearing her husband's coat, the one he swore he'd been wearing the night she disappeared. He was never charged. He left Montana a month later. Died in a car accident in Nevada in 1975. But people around Whitefish Ridge started reporting things after that. Knocking sounds at night during winter storms. A woman's voice calling names through the wind. Small footprints that appeared in fresh snow, leading to cabins and then stopping at doorways. Always stopping at doorways. As if waiting to be invited in. The cabin at Whitefish Ridge stands empty now. The timber company abandoned the property. Too many workers refused to stay there. Too many reported the same things, 3 knocks on the door in the dead of night. A woman's voice calling a name that wasn't theirs. The feeling of being watched through the windows when the forest was completely dark. Jim Talbot visited the cabin once more, a year after Marcus died. He went during summer, when the sun stayed up late and the woods were green and supposedly safe. He didn't go inside. He just stood in the clearing, looking at the structure, trying to reconcile what he'd seen that morning in February. As he was leaving, he noticed something carved into a tree near the path, a fresh carving, the bark still white and bleeding sap. He walked closer. It was a single word, scratched deep and deliberate. Marcus. Below it, in smaller letters, almost delicate. Welcome home. Jim Talbot hasn't been back since. And sometimes, on winter nights when the ridge gets hit with heavy storms, residents report seeing a light in the cabin's window. A faint, flickering glow, like candlelight. But there's no power up there anymore. And nobody is home. Story 2, The Snow Hollow Recordings. In December of 2011, a family of 4 moved into a rental home in Snow Hollow, Vermont, a former ski resort town that had fallen on hard times after the main lodge burned down in 1998. The population had dwindled to fewer than 300 year-round residents, most of them aging locals who'd been there for generations. The Pritchard family, David, his wife Melissa, and their 2 daughters, ages 9 and 12, relocated from Boston. David was a software developer who worked remotely, and they wanted a quiet place to raise their kids away from the city. The house they rented was a 2-story colonial at the edge of town, backing up to dense forest. It was cheap, spacious, and available immediately. There was a reason it was cheap. There was a reason it was available. The first week was normal. The family unpacked, enrolled the girls in the local school, started settling in. David set up his home office in a spare bedroom on the 2nd floor. Melissa began planning renovations, fresh paint, new fixtures, maybe refinish the hardwood floors. Then, on December 19th, their younger daughter, Emma, asked a question at dinner. "Who's the lady that stands outside my window?" The conversation stopped. David and Melissa exchanged glances. "What lady, honey?" Melissa asked carefully. "The one in the white nightgown. She stands by the tree and looks at my window. I see her when I wake up at night." David set down his fork. "Emma, there's no one out there. You're probably seeing shadows from the trees. She waves at me sometimes," Emma continued, unbothered by her father's tone. "But she looks sad." Their older daughter, Claire, rolled her eyes. "Emma's making stuff up again." But that night, David stood at Emma's window long after she'd fallen asleep, staring out at the tree line. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the snow-covered backyard. He could see how, maybe, a child's imagination might interpret the swaying branches as a figure. Maybe. The next incident occurred 3 days later. Melissa was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard Claire scream from upstairs. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart slamming against her ribs, and found Claire standing in the hallway, pointing at the bathroom door. "It was locked," Claire gasped. "From the inside. I was knocking, and then I heard someone. I heard someone crying in there. But when I tried the door again, it was unlocked and empty." Melissa checked the bathroom. Nothing. No signs of anything unusual. The window was sealed shut, painted over years ago. There was no way in except the door. You probably just thought it was locked, Melissa said, but her voice was uncertain. Old houses, sticky doors. Mom, I heard crying, Claire insisted. A woman crying. That afternoon, David installed a carbon monoxide detector. Maybe there was a gas leak, he reasoned. Something environmental causing auditory hallucinations. But the detector came back negative. The house was clean. The phenomena escalated. Over the next week, all 4 family members experienced something. David heard footsteps in the upstairs hallway at 3 a.m., walked out to investigate, and found every door in the corridor standing open, doors he'd personally closed before bed. Melissa woke to find wet footprints tracking through the kitchen, leading from the back door, locked, to the basement door, also locked. The prints were barefoot. Small. A woman's feet. They smelled like lake water, even though every body of water in the area was frozen solid. Emma reported the woman in white was now standing closer to the house. She's by the porch now, Emma said at breakfast. And Daddy, she doesn't have a face anymore. Just dark where her face should be. Claire refused to shower in the upstairs bathroom. When pressed, she admitted she'd seen someone's reflection in the mirror, standing behind her, but when she turned around, nothing was there. David didn't believe in ghosts. He was a rational man, an engineer by training. There had to be an explanation. Faulty wiring causing electromagnetic fields. Sleep paralysis. Stress from the move manifesting in shared delusions. He decided to prove it. On December 28th, David set up recording equipment throughout the house. Audio recorders in every room, motion-activated cameras in the hallways and common areas. If something was happening, he'd capture it. And if nothing was happening, he'd have proof they were experiencing a shared psychological episode that could be addressed with proper therapy. He turned everything on before the family went to bed that night. The cameras ran until 4:17 a.m., when every device simultaneously shut off. What David found the next morning changed him. The audio recorders had captured 7 hours of material before the blackout. David sat at his desk with headphones on, scrubbing through the files, looking for anomalies. For most of the night, there was nothing, just the ambient sounds of a house at rest. Furnace cycling. Wind against the windows. Occasional creaks from settling wood. Then, at 1:43 a.m., a sound appeared on the recorder in Emma's room. 3 soft knocks, like knuckles on glass. David increased the volume. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more knocks. Then, barely audible, a voice, "Emma, let me in, Emma." David's blood went cold. The voice was wrong. It had the cadence of human speech but the quality of something else, something that had learned to speak by listening, by mimicking, but didn't quite understand the mechanics. The words were stretched too long, the consonants too soft. He jumped ahead in the recording. At 2:31 a.m., the hallway recorder picked up footsteps. Bare feet on hardwood, the distinct sound of wet skin slapping against the floor. The footsteps walked from one end of the hall to the other, paused outside the bathroom door, then, nothing. No sound of a door opening. No retreating footsteps. Just silence. At 3:08 a.m., the kitchen recorder captured something that made David yank the headphones off. A woman's voice, singing. Not a song David recognized, something old, something folkish, the melody wandering and strange. The lyrics were indistinct, but the tone was mournful, grief-soaked. It sounded like someone singing to a child who would never wake up. The singing continued for 11 minutes. Then stopped abruptly, cut off mid-phrase. And in the silence that followed, David heard something else. Breathing. Close to the microphone. The slow, measured breathing of someone standing directly over the recorder, listening to their own voice play back. David was shaking as he checked the camera footage. The hallway camera showed nothing unusual until 2:31 a.m., when the motion sensor triggered. The video showed the empty corridor, lit only by the nightlight near the bathroom. For 5 seconds, nothing moved. Then the bathroom door opened. Slowly. From the inside. No hand pushed it. No figure stood in the doorway. It simply swung open, smooth and deliberate, until it stood fully ajar. David watched, his mouth dry, as something moved in the darkness of the bathroom. Not a figure, exactly. More like a concentration of shadow, a darkness that was somehow darker than the unlit room around it. It shifted, expanded, contracted, and then a hand emerged from the doorway. A woman's hand. Pale. Dripping. The hand reached around the doorframe and pressed against the hallway wall, fingers splayed wide. Water ran down the wallpaper from where the hand touched, leaving dark streaks. Then another hand appeared. And another. And another. 4 hands, emerging from the bathroom, all pressing against the walls and doorframe, all dripping, all wrong. They moved independently, searching, as if the thing in the bathroom was trying to pull itself out using too many limbs. The camera's timestamp read 2 hours 31 minutes and 47 seconds when the shadow condensed into a shape, a woman in a white nightgown, her long dark hair hanging in wet ropes, her head tilted at an angle that suggested a broken neck. Where her face should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin, as if her features had been erased. She stood in the hallway for 12 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward Emma's room. The camera lost sight of her as she moved down the corridor, but David could track her progress by checking the timestamp against the audio recordings. At 2:32 a.m., the recorder in Emma's room picked up the sound of breathing, not Emma's steady, sleeping breath, but something slower, heavier, wet. And then, at 2:33 a.m., a whisper, "I can't find it. I can't find it. Where did it go? Where did it go?" The whisper looped, the same phrase repeated in that stretched, imitation voice, growing more distressed with each repetition. In the video, David could see Emma's door was now ajar. He knew he'd closed it, knew Melissa had checked every door before bed. At 2:34 a.m., Emma's scream cut through the recording, and David could hear himself and Melissa running down the hall, their voices calling Emma's name. The bedroom camera showed them bursting into the room, turning on the lights, finding Emma sitting up in bed, pointing at the corner. She was standing right there, Emma sobbed on the recording. She was staring at me and she said my name, but she didn't have a face, she didn't have a face. But the camera showed no one in the corner. Just Emma, and her parents comforting her, and nothing else visible in the frame. Nothing else visible. David rewound the footage. Watched again. And this time, he noticed something he'd missed. In the corner Emma was pointing at, the shadows weren't quite right. They didn't match the light source. And if you looked carefully, if you really, really looked, you could see the outline of something standing there. Something that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Something that had pressed itself into the corner like it was trying to disappear into the wall. And in the audio, beneath Emma's crying and their voices, there was another sound. Humming. A woman, humming that same wandering melody from the kitchen recording, so quietly it was almost inaudible. Humming, as if waiting patiently for the family to leave so she could continue. David took the recordings to the police. They were skeptical. One officer suggested the motion sensors were glitching. Another mentioned that old houses make strange sounds. They filed a report but didn't investigate further. Desperate, David reached out to the property owner, a management company based in Burlington. After several insistent calls, he finally got a hold of someone who knew the house's history. The previous tenant, a woman named Catherine Weir, had lived there for 6 years. She'd moved in after her divorce, a single mother with a young daughter. Neighbors described her as withdrawn, increasingly paranoid. She'd stopped answering the door, stopped going to town. In March of 2011, Catherine had walked into the frozen lake 2 miles from the house. She was wearing a white nightgown. They found her body when the ice thawed in April. The autopsy concluded suicide by drowning, but noted several unusual findings. Her lungs contained very little water, suggesting she'd been dead before entering the lake. And she had bruising around her neck consistent with strangulation, self-inflicted, the coroner determined, though he admitted that was rare. Her daughter, Emily, 7 years old, had been found in the house 3 days after Catherine disappeared. Emily was alive but unresponsive, sitting in the corner of her room, staring at nothing. She hadn't eaten, hadn't moved. When social workers finally got her to speak, all she said was, "Mommy wouldn't stop knocking on my window. But she looked wrong. So I didn't let her in." Emily was placed in foster care. She never recovered psychologically. 2 years later, at age 9, she drowned in a bathtub at her foster home, doors locked from the inside, no signs of struggle. The property manager paused on the phone. "Look, we don't advertise this history. The house has been hard to rent. But legally, we've disclosed everything we need to. If you're experiencing discomfort, we can discuss breaking the lease early." David packed the family that night. The Pritchard family left Snow Hollow on December 30th, forfeiting their deposit, leaving half their furniture behind. David saved the recordings to an encrypted drive, backed them up to 3 separate locations. He shared them with paranormal researchers, skeptics, audio forensics experts. No one has found evidence of tampering. No one has found a rational explanation. But they found something else. Every audio expert who's analyzed the recordings has noted the same thing. Beneath all the other sounds, the footsteps, the singing, the whispers, there's a second layer of audio. It's pitched too low for most people to hear without software enhancement, but it's there. It's a voice. A child's voice. And it's saying, over and over, in a desperate loop, "Don't look like her. That's not her. Don't let her in. That's not her. That's not her. That's not her." The voice matches Emily Weir's, extracted from a school video recorded months before her mother's death. Which means the recording captured something else. Something that spoke at frequencies below normal human hearing, trying to warn the new family. Trying to protect them from the thing that had pretended to be its mother. The thing that was still pretending. The thing that's still knocking on windows in Snow Hollow, still appearing in mirrors, still searching for a child who will open the door. Still learning to be more convincing. David Pritchard hasn't slept properly since leaving that house. He lies awake in their new home, a ground-floor apartment in the suburbs, no forest within miles, and listens to the silence. Sometimes, late at night, he thinks he hears knocking. 3 soft knocks. A pause. 3 more. And his daughter Emma, now 12, sometimes stares out her window at night, watching the street. When Melissa asks what she's looking for, Emma says, "I want to make sure she didn't follow us." But she never says who she is. She doesn't have to. Story 3, The Whiteout Incident. On January 14, 2017, 5 college students from the University of New Hampshire drove north for a weekend ski trip. They rented a cabin near the White Mountains, a region known for unpredictable weather and terrain that can turn lethal without warning. Their names were Tyler Morrison, Jade Chen, Marcus Holloway, Bethany Krause, and David Nguyen. Ages 19 to 21. Friends since freshman year. This was supposed to be their last winter trip together before graduation pulled them in different directions. 4 of them made it home. 1 didn't. And what the survivors reported, well, the official investigation concluded it was impossible. Trauma-induced false memories brought on by hypothermia and stress. But the survivors all told the same story. Word for word. Detail for detail. And 2 years later, one of them went back to the mountains. They found her tent. They found her journal. They never found her. The group arrived Friday afternoon, spirits high, weather clear. The cabin was rustic but well equipped, 2 bedrooms, a working kitchen, a fireplace. They unpacked, stocked the fridge with food and beer, planned their weekend. Saturday they'd hit the slopes. Sunday they'd hike one of the easier trails before heading back. That night, they stayed up late around the fire, talking and laughing, occasionally stepping outside to marvel at the stars, so bright up here, away from city lights, a field of white pinpricks against absolute black. Tyler, who considered himself an amateur astronomer, pointed out constellations. It's crazy how much we can't see from down in the cities. There's so much more out there. Sometimes I think there's too much, Jade said quietly. She was staring at the tree line, where the forest formed a dark wall against the snow. Like, all that emptiness. All that space for things to exist that we don't know about. Getting philosophical on us? Marcus teased. Jade smiled but didn't look away from the trees. Just a feeling. They went to bed around midnight. The temperature was dropping fast, forecast called for single digits by morning. They made sure the fire was banked, the doors locked, the heat set to maintain at least 50 degrees. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Until 3:47 a.m., when Bethany woke to the sound of scratching. Bethany lay in her sleeping bag, listening. The scratching was coming from the wall behind her head, a steady, rhythmic sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. Slow. Deliberate. She assumed it was an animal, mice in the walls, maybe a squirrel that had gotten into the eaves. She rolled over, tried to ignore it. The scratching stopped. Then started again on a different wall. The one facing the forest. Bethany sat up. In the other bed, Jade was also awake, staring at the window. You hear that? Bethany whispered. Jade nodded. Something's outside. The scratching moved. It traveled along the exterior wall of the cabin, slow and methodical, as if something was walking around the structure, dragging its nails across the wood siding. They could hear it through the walls, distinct and impossibly close. The scratching reached the front door. Stopped. Then, 3 knocks. Heavy. Spaced evenly apart. Bethany and Jade looked at each other. Neither moved. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. Then a voice, "Help, please. I'm lost." It was a man's voice, strained and desperate. He sounded injured, or freezing, or both. Jade swung out of bed, but Bethany grabbed her arm. "Wait. Someone needs help," Jade hissed. "At 4 in the morning? In the middle of nowhere? How?" They woke the others. Tyler, Marcus, and David emerged from the second bedroom, groggy and confused. By the time they reached the main room, the knocking had stopped. "There's someone outside," Jade explained. They were calling for help. Tyler moved toward the door. Marcus stopped him. "Did you see anyone?" "No, but..." "Then how do we know anyone's out there?" As if in answer, the knocking resumed. 3 heavy impacts that shook the door in its frame. "Help, please, so cold." The voice was weaker now, more desperate. Tyler reached for the deadbolt. David stepped forward. "Wait. Look at the window." They turned. The front window of the cabin faced the small parking area where they'd left their cars. Outside, visible in the ambient light from the cabin, was undisturbed snow. Fresh snow that had fallen overnight, coating everything in a smooth, perfect layer. No footprints. No tracks. No sign that anything or anyone had approached the cabin. "That's impossible," Tyler said. We all heard. The knocking came again, more insistent. 3 knocks. 3 knocks. 3 knocks. And the voice, "Please, dying out here, please." But now they could all hear something wrong with the voice. It wasn't quite right. The desperation was there, but it felt performed. Like someone doing an impression of a person in distress, hitting all the right notes but missing something essential. "I don't think we should open that door," Bethany said quietly. The knocking stopped. For 10 seconds, silence. Then every window in the cabin rattled simultaneously, as if something had struck the entire structure at once. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped so suddenly they could see their breath mist in front of their faces. And from outside, circling the cabin, they heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Multiple sets of footsteps. Walking in a coordinated pattern, around and around, the sound growing faster. "What the fuck?" Marcus breathed. David moved to the back window, peered through the curtains. "I can't see anything. Just snow and trees and..." He stopped. "What?" Jade asked. David pointed. In the forest, perhaps 50 yards from the cabin, there were lights. Not flashlight beams, these were different. Spheres of pale, greenish luminescence, hovering between the trees at head height. As they watched, the lights began to move, gliding through the forest in single file, tracing a path that led toward the cabin. "Northern Lights reflection?" Tyler suggested, but his voice cracked. "Aurora doesn't look like that," David said. "Aurora doesn't move like that." The lights reached the tree line and stopped. They hovered there, pulsing faintly, arranged in a rough semicircle facing the cabin. And then, from the forest, they heard it, singing. Multiple voices, harmonizing, the melody eerily similar to a children's lullaby but with words that didn't quite sound like English. The song echoed through the trees, carried on wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. "We need to leave," Bethany said. "Now. We get in the cars and we drive." They grabbed coats, pulled on boots. Tyler and Marcus went to start the vehicles while the others gathered essentials. But when Tyler opened the front door, he froze. The singing stopped. The lights in the forest winked out. And standing in the parking area, arranged in a perfect line between them and the vehicles, were 7 figures. They looked human. Almost. They wore winter clothes, jackets, boots, hats, but the clothes were wrong. Too old-fashioned. Too pristine despite the weather. And the figures stood completely motionless, not swaying, not breathing visible mist into the cold air. Their faces were turned toward the cabin. Even in the darkness, the group could see that much. What they couldn't see, what their minds refused to process until Tyler aimed his phone's flashlight at the nearest figure, were the details. The figure's face was smooth. No features. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just blank skin stretched over where a face should be. All 7 figures had the same empty faces. "Get back inside," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "Get back inside right now." They slammed the door, through the deadbolt, backed away into the center of the room. Outside, the figures didn't move. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. The group huddled together, watching the door, watching the windows, phones out and ready to call 911, though up here, emergency services were at least 40 minutes away even in good conditions. Then the scratching started again. Not on one wall. On all of them. Surrounding the cabin. A coordinated rhythm of nails on wood, growing louder, more aggressive, as if dozens of hands were clawing at the structure from every side. The lights flickered again. This time, they went out completely. In the darkness, Jade whispered, "They're trying to get in." What followed was 6 hours of siege. The scratching continued in waves. Periods of intense activity where the entire cabin seemed to shake, followed by stretches of silence more terrifying than the noise. During the quiet, they could hear things moving around outside, footsteps, breathing, and occasionally that singing, rising and falling like a tide. They tried their phones. No signal. The landline in the cabin was dead. Tyler attempted to reach one of the vehicles. He made it 3 steps out the door before something grabbed his ankle. He fell face first into the snow, and the other saw a hand, pale, too long-fingered, wrapped around his boot. Marcus and David hauled him back inside, slamming the door as something struck it from outside with enough force to crack the wood. Tyler was hyperventilating, pointing at his boot. There were finger marks seared into the leather, as if the hand that grabbed him had been burning hot. As dawn approached, the activity intensified. The blank-faced figures pressed against the windows, their smooth faces pushing the glass inward. Their hands left prints on the frost, but the prints looked wrong, the fingers too numerous, branching like tree roots. And then Bethany made the connection. "The lights," she said. "The orbs in the forest. They're luring lights. Like anglerfish. And the knocking, the voice asking for help, it's bait." "Bait for what?" Jade asked. "For us to open the door. To invite them in." David was pale. "What the fuck are they? Does it matter?" Marcus snapped. "They can't get in unless we let them, so we just wait until sunrise." And one of the bedroom windows shattered. They ran to find a figure halfway through, its torso bent at an impossible angle as it folded itself through the narrow opening. Its faceless head turned toward them, and though it had no eyes, they could feel it seeing them. Tyler grabbed a fireplace poker, swung it at the figure. The metal passed through its shoulder like it was striking fog, no resistance, no impact. But where the poker passed through, the figure's form rippled and distorted, and it made a sound like wind through a cave. It withdrew, sliding back through the broken window with movements that defied anatomy. "The fire," David said suddenly. "They don't like the fire." He was right. The figures kept their distance from the fireplace, and when Tyler had swung the poker, still hot from stirring the coals, the thing had reacted. They spent the next hour feeding everything combustible into the fireplace, building it into an inferno. Chairs, magazines, the wooden table. The cabin became sweltering, the air thick with smoke, but the scratching lessened. As the sun began to rise, the activity stopped entirely. The figures were gone. The forest was silent. The group waited until full daylight, then cautiously stepped outside. Their vehicles were untouched. No footprints surrounded the cabin except their own from the day before. The only evidence anything had happened was the broken window, the scratches on the walls, and the fact that all 5 of them were shaking uncontrollably. They drove down the mountain in convoy, not stopping until they reached the state police barracks 40 miles away. The police investigated. They found the scratches, the broken window, the seared handprint on Tyler's boot. But they found no prints in the snow, no sign of intruders, no explanation. Their conclusion: the group had experienced a combination of sleep paralysis, shared delusion brought on by carbon monoxide exposure, and possible hallucinogens in the cabin's water supply. The scratches? Animals. The broken window? Thermal stress from temperature fluctuation. The boot print? A manufacturing defect made noticeable by stress. The 5 students didn't argue. They knew what they'd experienced. They also knew no one would believe them. They stayed in touch for a while after graduation. But the incident had changed something between them. There was a tension now, a shared trauma that made every interaction feel heavy. Marcus refused to discuss it. Tyler developed insomnia. David started seeing a therapist. Bethany threw herself into work, avoiding anything that reminded her of that night. But Jade couldn't let it go. She researched the area, found old records, folklore, incident reports. The White Mountains had a history of disappearances, especially in winter. Hikers who vanished without a trace. Skiers who were found frozen miles from any trail, their expressions suggesting they'd been running from something. And there were stories, old stories, dismissed as legend, about the Cold Walkers. Entities that appeared during the deepest winter, drawn to human warmth and light. They mimicked voices, created lures, waited for permission to cross thresholds. Once invited in, they would replace you. Wear your shape. Walk in your life. And the real you would join them in the forest, faceless and hollow, helping to lure the next victim. Jade became obsessed. In January of 2019, 2 years after the incident, she returned to the mountains alone. She told her roommate she needed closure. She'd be back in a week. She never came back. Search and rescue found Jade's campsite 3 weeks later. Her tent was set up properly, supplies intact, no signs of struggle. But Jade was gone. They found her journal in the tent. The last entry, dated January 19, 2019, read, "I've been watching the tree line for 3 nights. Nothing. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe we really did hallucinate everything. But tonight feels different. The temperature is dropping fast, and I keep seeing movement between the trees. Lights. Just like before. They're getting closer. I can hear singing. God, I remember that singing. Something just knocked on my tent. 3 times. It sounds like Tyler. It sounds exactly like Tyler, asking me to let him in, saying he got lost hiking and needs help. But Tyler is in Boston. I texted him an hour ago. I'm not opening the tent. I'm not opening the tent. I'm not." The entry ended there. Searchers found something else, a line of footprints leading from Jade's tent into the forest. Bare footprints. In snow. In temperatures well below freezing. They followed the prints for half a mile before they stopped abruptly, as if Jade had simply vanished mid-stride. But scattered around where the prints ended, they found 7 sets of boot prints, arranged in a circle. And in the center of the circle, pressed into the snow, was a message written with a finger. "Don't come back." The handwriting matched Jade's. The search continued for another month. They never found Jade Chen. The remaining 4 members of the group received letters in March of 2019. Identical letters, handwritten, with no return address. The handwriting looked like Jade's. Each letter contained the same message. "I understand now. They don't want to hurt us. They want to become us. They're so cold, and they've been alone so long, and they just want to be warm again. To be human again. It's not so bad once you stop fighting. Don't worry. I'll see you again. When it's cold enough. When you're alone enough. When you finally open the door." Tyler moved to Arizona. He won't live anywhere that snows. Marcus refuses to go outside after dark during winter. David has a standing rule: never answer unexpected knocks, never investigate strange sounds, never, ever respond to someone calling for help unless you can see them. Bethany is the only one who still lives in New England. Last winter, during a particularly brutal cold snap, she woke to knocking on her door. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. And a voice, "Bethany, it's me, please let me in. I'm so cold." It sounded exactly like Jade. Bethany didn't open the door. She sat on her floor with her back against the wall, crying silently, until sunrise. When she finally looked outside, there were footprints in the snow. Bare footprints. Leading from the forest to her door. And then away. Into the woods. Where 7 figures stood at the tree line, watching her windows. Bethany sold her house the next day. She lives in Florida now. She doesn't plan on ever experiencing winter again. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, even in Florida, she hears singing in her dreams. And she wakes to find herself standing at her window, her hand on the lock, ready to open it. Ready to let them in. She catches herself every time. So far. 3 stories. 3 winters. 3 reminders that the cold isn't the only thing that hunts when the temperature drops. Sometimes, what waits in the snow is patient. It can wait decades. Centuries. It knows you'll come back eventually. That someone will always be desperate enough, curious enough, or lonely enough to open the door when something knocks. Just remember, if you hear 3 knocks in the dead of winter, if you hear a familiar voice calling for help, if you see lights moving through the forest, don't look. Don't answer. And whatever you do, don't open the door. Stay safe out there. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed these stories, leave a like and subscribe for more true winter horror. Share your own winter encounters in the comments. We read every single one. Remember, the best way to survive winter is to never be alone in it. Until next time, stay warm.